So this is it. This is going to be, at this point, my intended final discussion breakdown video ahead of Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. Don't get me wrong, I might well do further videos relating to the weigh-in, the press conference, TV programming. I'm sure there'll be some videos on the night. But in terms of pre-fight predictions, pre-fight breakdowns, this video is where it is at. Let me first say, and I'll keep it very, very brief on this, I've launched the Boxing Gossip newsletter. First newsletter is going out in the next 2-3 days. If you'd like to be included on that for channel updates, videos that are coming out, etc., please comment below with your email address or drop me an email at boxinggossip@gmail.com and I will add your name to the list. With regards to Mayweather-Pacquiao, a lot of people are convinced that this is going to be a really, really tight fight. I watched HBO The Legends speak, and it was really interesting how all of those guys seemed to think it could be very tight, could go either way, was very up in the air. I still don't see it that way. I don't see it that way whatsoever. I mean, people are talking about Manny Pacquiao potentially knocking Floyd Mayweather out. I really don't understand that. I don't understand that for two reasons. Firstly, I don't think Manny Pacquiao is much of a knockout artist these days. I mean, Floyd Mayweather is a guy who has never shown any chin deficiencies. He is one of the elite defensive boxers of all time. Manny Pacquiao is a guy who's just gone the distance with fighters like Chris Algieri and Brandon Rios. He didn't stop Tim Bradley in 24 rounds. Like Tim Bradley, Brandon Rios, Chris Algieri, they're all decent fighters. Bradley's a top 5 welterweight. Algieri, Rios, they're probably top 15, top 20 operators. They're not terrible opposition. But Manny Pacquiao is not dropping these guys. Sorry, he's not ending these guys. He's not knocking them out. I mean, Brandon Rios, this is the same guy who got outboxed by Mike Alvarado. Chris Algieri is the same guy, who's getting dropped by Ruslan Provodnikov. These are not elite defensive fighters. These are not elite technicians. And yet Manny Pacquiao was unable to close the show and knock these opponents out. What I don't get is when people take that in mind, that Pacquiao hasn't knocked these guys out, what makes you think that Floyd Mayweather's going to get knocked out by Manny Pacquiao? Surely you would agree that Floyd is a better defensive fighter than Rios. He's a better defensive fighter than Algieri. So why is Manny going to knock Floyd out and not those guys? I mean, when was the last time Manny Pacquiao knocked anyone out? What sort of recent form leads you to believe that Mayweather's there to be knocked out by Pacquiao? I mean, what I've seen recently is Mayweather fighting really big guys who punch very hard, guys who are bigger than Manny Pacquiao, guys like Saul Canelo Alvarez, guys like Marcus Maidana. These are guys who massively outweighed Floyd when Floyd got into the ring with them. Pacquiao's not going to outweigh Floyd. Pacquiao in 2015 is not going to hit hard as Canelo Alvarez. Pacquiao is a small man on fight night compared to Canelo Alvarez. So I think this talk of a knockout is vastly exaggerated. Vastly exaggerated. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily see Floyd knocking out Manny Pacquiao. Floyd, similarly, isn't a great knockout artist. He isn't a massive puncher. The guys, for what it's worth, have a similar knockout KO ratio, but, clearly Floyd is not a sort of Gennady Golovkin style puncher. What I would say is, if there is a knockout, I think it's more likely Floyd KOs Manny. The reason being, Manny has shown that he perhaps doesn't have an all-time great chin. Manny is probably not an all-time great defensive fighter. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Pacquiao's got a glass jaw. I'm not saying he's horrible technically, but if you said which one of these guys had given you the most reason for concern over their chin or over their defence, it's got to be Manny Pacquiao. I mean, he was left on the floor with his trainer concerned whether he was still alive after the fight with Juan Manuel Marquez. You've never seen that with Floyd Mayweather. So whilst I think a knockout is very unlikely. If there is to be a knockout, I genuinely believe it's more likely that Floyd will KO Manny rather than the other way around. I see it going points, however. Now, for me, there's been talk that's again vastly exaggerated about how Manny can overwhelm Floyd. I mean, yes, Manny brings foot speed, hand speed, combinations to the table. But haven't all of Floyd's opponents tried to overwhelm him? Didn't Ricky Hatton try to overwhelm him? Didn't, more recently, Marcus Maidana try and overwhelm him? You know, Floyd is a guy who is used to being the low volume guy, the low output guy, the counter puncher. Floyd probably throws less combinations than Manny Pacquiao. You know, however, has that negatively affected Floyd before? Not really, in my mind. You know, for Floyd, it's all about quality over quantity. And I don't see Manny Pacquiao necessarily overwhelming him, if we consider that when Pacquiao has looked at his most vulnerable, it's actually been against highly technical counter-punching boxer types. You know, let's be honest, Pacquiao probably didn't lose a round against, Chris Algieri, Brandon Rios. Who are the guys who've taken rounds of Manny Pacquiao recently? Tim Bradley. I know the fights with Pacquiao and Bradley are controversial, but let's agree that Bradley had some success. Juan Manuel Marquez, again, a collection of controversial fights. But let's say that Pacquiao was at least caused problems by these guys. Now we know that Floyd Mayweather is similar to Marquez and Bradley in the sense that he's also a boxer. He's a guy who relies on technical capability rather than, raw power. He's a guy who counterpunches. He's a guy who jabs. He's a guy who moves. But we know Mayweather is head and shoulders above Marquez and Bradley. We saw what Mayweather did to Marquez when they fought. We saw Bradley dropping a draw to Chavez, getting into a war with Provodnikov. We know Mayweather operates on a higher level than Marquez and Bradley. Yet we saw the trouble they caused Pacquiao with their counterpunching, with their traps, with their technical boxing style. Sorely bearing that in mind, it's much more likely that Floyd is going to be causing Manny issues rather than the other way round. I mean, I know people have got this suspicion that Mayweather's vulnerable to southpaws, and potentially he isn't at his absolute best against southpaws. But I think Manny Pacquiao is a somewhat predictable fighter. There's so much footage on him. There's so many tapes of him fighting Marquez and fighting Tim Bradley, and Mayweather will have studied those. He will. He knows the game. He'll be anticipating what Pacquiao's going to do. He'll be anticipating the moves Pacquiao's going to make. And Manny Pacquiao, to me, is not the most versatile fighter. He's got one or two strings to his bow. And I think, the blueprint on how to beat him is already there from the Bradley fights and the Marquez fights. I expect Mayweather to take a look at him rounds 1 and 2, maybe drop those rounds, and then dominate throughout the rest of the fight. I think Manny Pacquiao can be counterpunched. I think there are large, gaping holes in Manny Pacquiao's defence. I think an elite defensive fighter like Floyd Mayweather, who can lean backwards and shoulder roll, could potentially anticipate some of the Manny Pacquiao offence. And I think fundamentally, stylistically, this works out so much better for Floyd Mayweather. I mean, Floyd Mayweather is very used to fighters trying to overwhelm him, and none of them have succeeded. Manny Pacquiao doesn't like it when fighters sit back and try and counterpunch him. It is possible to be a lower volume fighter than Manny Pacquiao and get the job done. I honestly see Floyd winning the fight. My most sensible prediction is Floyd winning on points. I think Pacquiao will cause some problems and have some success, but I think it will be something like 9 rounds to 3, 8 rounds to 4. And I think whilst the scorecards potentially, would look vaguely competitive, maybe something like a 116, 112, something of that ilk, whilst the scorecards may be competitive, I think when the bell goes at the end of the night, there won't be too much suggestion that Manny Pacquiao has won the fight. The conspiracy theorists obviously have a point that any sort of controversial decision is financially beneficial to both guys, as you know, if it's a tight fight, for example, as the rematch could be even bigger financially than this fight, you know, potentially that is something to consider. But assuming that this fight is fought properly, I see Floyd winning. I think points the most likely. And I think the suggestion that Manny Pacquiao, who hasn't been KOing the likes of Chris Algieri, is suddenly going to KO the elite defensive fighter of our time is bizarre. I know this opinion's unpopular. I know Manny Pacquiao's got a selection of very passionate fans who follow him religiously. But that's my opinion. We won't have to wait much longer. We're going to find out very, very soon indeed. Let me know your thoughts. As always, keen to discuss. Thanks for watching.